Well, hello, friends. It's a gift to have Reverend Dr. Scott Black Johnston with us today as we discuss a recent book that he wrote. Scott comes to us from New York. He serves Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church. Is it 55th and 5th? Do I have that right?
That
Scott,
is absolutely right.
right there in Manhattan, close to Central Park, close to Trump Tower. It's a beautiful church, and they're doing very meaningful ministry. But Scott's been there some 15 years. Is that
That's
about
correct. Yes.
and this book he recently wrote, Elusive Grace, Loving Your Enemies While Striving for God's Justice. Um, it's a profound and thoughtful work, and we've been working our way through it in Eastertide with our adult faith formation class. It's sort of three different studies. I'll let him explain a bit more about the book, but he was gracious enough to give us a few minutes to hear more about the book, why he felt compelled to write it, put it out into the world. And then we have a few particular questions. We'll see where the Spirit leads. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I just want to say to your people, I'm truly honored that you've taken some time to look at this book.
Yeah. Yeah. You open the book, Scott, with a story about you and your colleague, Patrick O'Connor, at a Presbyterian church in Queens nearby, as you put together a meeting with then President-elect Trump, where you met with him for a few minutes, prayed together, and some of the surprising reaction you received across the church, both supportive and folks feeling betrayed and frustrated. But I'd love to read just a paragraph from your introduction that I think captures why you wrote the book, and would love to hear you say a bit more about this. So this is on page 6. You say, what does it look like to embrace both justice and love? How can you call for repentance and work toward reconciliation? You'd isolated the phrase from Andrew Sullivan about the great awokening as this time in which we are finding ourselves as the church and as folks in the U.S. You mentioned the first two great awakenings, and then you find yourself reflecting again on that grandmother of all theological words, grace. Grace is an incredibly important but sadly elusive notion right now. It feels nigh on impossible in the context of the Great Awakening to work through complicated ethical issues and craft plans for systemic change without getting crosswise with each other, without causing each other pain. And here's your appeal. Still, our faith calls us to try to get in the mix and bring to the table both a commitment to truth and a commitment to grace. I love how you isolate both truth and grace, and especially the fact that grace feels elusive. So could you say a bit more, Scott, about the context from which this book comes, and in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of your own life? Just tell us a little more.
Yeah, maybe the place to start is a little bit with that notion of a great awakening. And one of the things I do quickly in the book is talk about two historical periods that historians agree upon in American, religious history, and those are the two great awakenings. Both were times of great moral conversation, conversation about ethics everywhere you would go in society. You would have these kind of rich ethical conversations. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, in the midst of the first Great Awakening, just commented that it's like everywhere he went, people wanted to talk about ethics, morality, religion, and so those two moments grew up out of the church. The first moment really grew up in this country because of clergy who were concerned that Christians had become kind of limp, and that their faith really didn't make any difference in their lives. And so let's stir it up. And then the second Great Awakening really came out of a time when the concern was that faith was not doing enough to tackle some of society's biggest ills, and amongst those were alcoholism, temperance, that sort of thing, the role of women in society, and then of course slavery. And so those were times of great, moral, ethic, religious conversation about some specific society-wide issues. And so it was Andrew Sullivan, as you mentioned, who I first heard use the term the Great Awokening to describe the current moment, a moment in which, everywhere you go, people are talking about morality, and so wokeness, what exactly that is. It means different things for different people, but it has to do in part with sort of becoming aware of and responsive to a number of ethical issues within the wider society. Some of them are more focused on individuals, but mostly it's wider concerns. So the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, these larger conversations are happening out there all around our society, and Sullivan pointed to that and said, look, we're in another period of this sort of fertile moral conversation. Now, he's not necessarily baptizing that by calling it the Great Awakening. He's somewhat critical of it, and the place where he's critical I find interesting. A Catholic layperson, Sullivan's criticism is that what you have is all the moral fervor without the religious underpinnings. And what does that mean? And he doesn't say lots about what he thinks it means, but I do. I want to say that I think there's something missing when you take religion out of the equation, and that's the elusive grace of the book. Is we're having a moral conversation, and you actually have people say it's just fine if the church stays on the sidelines, it's okay for them to feel that way. I don't. I think it's important for us to be in the mix because we bring something, a sort of attitude about moral conversations at our best that I think is helpful in this moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Last week in the adult faith formation class I'm leading, we had a generative discussion about the truth chapter in the middle of your book. In section 2, it's learning to love truth and learning to love mercy. I think those were the 2 chapters we read, and we wondered about, in First John in the New Testament, Gospel of John chapter 1, it describes Jesus as full of grace and truth. And someone else brought up the invitation in Ephesians to sort of speak the truth in love. Could you say a bit more about the relationship between grace and truth in your context at Fifth Avenue or elsewhere? Do you think those are symbiotic virtues? Do you think when one is bigger, the other is smaller? What are you seeing?
Well, I think first of all, it's a great question, and it actually does cut to the heart of what's going on right now. There's a couple of different ways I want to come at this, but I'll start with this. Speaking the truth, and I have the chapter on there. I think it's very important that we agree upon truths, that we can, in any conversation, in order to engage each other, we have to have agreed upon truths. And it sometimes can be very difficult to work toward that, but that's important. Sometimes there's the assumption that if you just speak the truth, then you've done all that you need to do. And I don't think that that's true. And I think that's where, full of grace and truth, such a beautiful way to describe Jesus is, to think of, those two things intertwined. They flavor each other. And the way that grace flavors truth is it helps the other understand that you're telling the truth not to beat them up or to shame them, but to seek some sort of higher good communally. And so that's what mercy and grace bring to the to the equation in my mind. It's actually helping truth be heard. It's not softening it. It's not taking away, the impact of it, but it's learning how to wield truth not as a weapon.
Yeah.
And one of the people, that I quote in the book, a professor at Smith, I think, is she talks about, cancel culture and all that, but she talks about the brutal ways in which she has viewed her students engage each other in social media.
Mhm.
And she's like, I, I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish, because you need to remember this first very basic fact. People will remember how you treat them
Yes.
long after they remember what you said.
Yes. Yes.
And so if that's the lasting impression that we make on people, we need to remember that we're the disciples of Jesus Christ. And so, whacking each other with truth, versus engaging each other with love and mercy, it feels different. People know how it feels different, and we all know that. We all know when we just like kind of cross the line and we've really like just like squished somebody, and that's
Yeah.
that takes a lot of work to repair that too.
Yeah.
A lot of time and effort, if it's even possible.
Mhm.
And in this society, it's just like right now we're just like willing to squish left and right.
Yes.
And then we're like, why are people so angry at each other? I'm like, what do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful as a frame to not erode truth, but season it with grace and remember that lasting impression. It wasn't Maya Angelou who talked about, yeah, people might not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Yes.
I'm probably
Yes.
butchering the quote, but
No. You're exactly right. That's Maya Angelou, and I think
yeah.
it's Catherine Roberts, I think, might have been the woman who was at Smith who was talking about her students in social
Yeah.
media.
Is she the one who talks about shifting call out culture to call in?
Yes,
Like inviting a
that is
conversation? Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a helpful reframe. And very countercultural right now.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's I was at breakfast with somebody this morning, and they asked me, they said, well, why do you think this group of people is so mad at this group of people? And I said, they feel hurt by them. They felt dismissed by them and shamed by them all their lives. And you know, and I'm not even telling you which group is which, because you can just go through every debate. I don't care whether it's on race or on, class, education level, geography, where they live. It's it's sort of like that, the old military salt the earth. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're fighting these battles, and we're leaving salt behind, and that means nothing's going to grow in those fields for some time.
Right. Shifting gears a little bit, Scott, another chapter I was really moved by was in your first part on the heavenly virtues that you name. The last three you ended on were faith, hope, and love, and you wrote this lovely letter to it's your son, right, Oliver,
Yeah.
about faith, and kind of modeled it on one you'd read from Richard Dawkins, I think, who's the scientist, atheist, who was talking about kind of trusting in facts and the primacy of science over religion, and it seemed like Oliver was younger than, I don't know how many years ago you'd written it, but I wonder, would you write the same thing today? Would you, as a parent and pastor myself, I'm always curious about, putting this, as you put this book together, sort of the different callings in your life as a parent, as partner, as pastor, how you seek to kind of pass on the faith, embody it yourself, but as you think about your own children.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, he's older. He's a freshman in college right now. So I'm actually heading out to Minnesota in a couple of weeks to help him move out of his freshman dorm.
Oh, good.
And it's I think for me, this particular, I'd come across the letter that Dawkins wrote to his daughter, um, and so that made me think about, the format of a potential, sermon. But the format is good because it does call forth. I found myself really, I want to say what I really want to say to my son, and at it, at appropriate age. And so this letter's 5 or 6 years old now.
Mhm.
And so, um, you know, I think I'd probably write it somewhat differently, but I think the points that I would make would be similar in that, what Dawkins implies, and I think this is not only wrong, but it makes Dawkins, who is a smart guy, and I
Sure.
appreciate the fact that he engages.
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to be engaging him in the study of biology, and but what he basically says to his daughter is, oh, there are these stories that people pass down, and they don't think critically about it. And the stories really don't mean anything anymore. And they just kind of pass them down because that's what people do.
Right.
And and they don't have value or truth to them.
Mhm.
Now that to me, I was just like, well, wait a minute. So if basically he's arguing that if it isn't hard science, then it's not true. I'm like, the greatest novels ever written, are not true.
Mhm.
Plays of Shakespeare are not true in examining the human condition and the things that make us do good and bad things. That's a ridiculous, in my opinion, assertion. So just to assert that, that our religious stories don't have insight into humanity and humanity's search for ultimate meaning and relationship with, and this is a point where he's really going to roll his eyes, relationship with God. I found that like surprising. I'm like, how can you just dismiss
Mhm.
that whole swath of human experience and learning? And
Mhm.
so I wanted to address with Oliver why I thought that whole swath of human experience is really important. Um, and um, and and I'll just tell you a little bit about my son. My son is this interesting amalgam. He's really is a kind of he's very interested and does well in the hard sciences,
Mhm.
but he also like his semester right now, he's got like algorithms for computer science, which is at a level I don't even understand. And then a sculpture class, and which
Really?
and so he's got this art and science thing going together, and I'm just thrilled that that's who he is, and I
Mhm.
think he's open to the truths that are available in those different realms and sees them differently, and so that's sort of what I was trying to get at. I was just trying to say, don't shut this out of your life because it's important, and it will become incredibly important at some of the hardest moments for you.
Mhm.
And so that's what I wanted to gift him with.
Yeah.
And um I was really happy, this as an aside, that when the book came out, so he was in his first trimester of college, and I got an email from him and said, Dad, can you send me a copy of the book? So
Oh, good.
yeah,
It's high praise. Yeah, from
yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Oh, that's great, Scott. Well, that was beautiful to read. As a parent myself, I'm someone who our kids are younger. They're 8, 5, and 2. But yeah, they grow up so quickly, and they're their own people. They have their own path, but how to pass on
Yeah,
this this story of love and the work and ministry of Jesus. Um, Maybe just
yeah.
one final prompt or question, Scott, and then we can wrap up. In the final section of the book, you focus on the resources the church can offer in this time of division and justice, and I think those resources are particularly apropos in the subtitle of the book, which several of our folks were drawn by because of the kind of paradox it entails. Loving your enemies while striving for God's justice. You know, what does that look like? So say more how you think those two fit together. The command from Jesus to arguably the hardest thing he asked us to do, to love our enemies, and also the call to strive for God's justice. What's the relationship between justice and love, or what does that look like?
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to tell you a story, actually, something that happened just this past weekend here at Fifth Avenue Church. On my way to that story, though, I'll say that the last section of the book for me, it's the section on church, as you said, and it is. I'm trying to say what I think the church can offer to this moment, and where it is that we are well practiced. And so one of the examples I use in there is something that happens in worship every week. It's the confessional sequence. It's, we're called to confess. We confess, our sins together. We hear, the pastor speak the pardon of God, the assurance of pardon. And, at Fifth Avenue, we share the peace. And that arc of telling the truth, seeking forgiveness, hearing God's grace spoken, and then being challenged to engage each other with peace and to work for the reconciliation of the world is exactly what our society needs right now. And we do it every single week. And it becomes so deep in us that I don't know whether you use a different prayer of confession or we use the same one every week, and people can say it without even looking at their bulletin. And that, I think, is a powerful thing. So my story is this, what does the church have to bring? So Fifth Avenue Church has been around a long time. We were planted in 1808. So I like to tell people that, in our session records, the church talks about how hard it is to live on the island of Manhattan when it's being blockaded by the British during the War of 1812. So it's like crazy to be serving a church that's got that kind of roots. The establishing pastor of the church was a guy named John Broadhead Romaine, and Romaine served from 1808 to 1825. He came down from Albany, New York, was called to start the church by a group of people in Manhattan. The church moved around. It had like 3 locations, and then it moved to its current location in 1875. But Romaine is interesting because we'd long recognized of the 26 charter founding members of the church, the last name on the list always said Betsy Jackson, enslaved woman. And so we'd seen that there, and we were proud of that. We were proud that we had somebody who, was a founding charter member of the church, who was, somebody who at that time, was an enslaved person, and that this community was welcoming. Well, in 2018, right, 2 years before the pandemic hit, John Jay College released this massive online searchable thing about the New York slavery records. And we discovered in there that Betsy Jackson was a household slave in the home of the founding pastor.
Oh, really?
And so that became a sort, there was an audible gasp in the congregation when I announced that. And then people started coming up to me, and there was a lot of hand wringing, like, what are we going to do? Are we going to cancel John Broadhead Romaine? What are we going to do about this? This is, shameful. This is embarrassing. Others came up and said, we shouldn't be surprised. Of course, this was, happy, and so there was a whole lot of different reactions and a lot of nervousness. How are we going to deal with this? Is this going to somehow tear us apart? And so we put together 3 successive task forces to work on this issue. And where we came out, each task force moved the ball forward a little bit. Where we came out was we did a lot of research on Romaine. He was not an apologist for slavery. He doesn't come out as like the good guy, the hero and all this. But he did call slavery a sin late in his ministry, and you can speculate about, why, but he did free her. And that document is now on the wall in the church because it's powerful and also sort of indicting. What we ended up deciding was, we have a room, the John Broadhead Romaine room. Then they were like, well, do we say something in the room? And then they decided, no, we want to name a room in the church after Betsy Jackson and give her own space. And they decided to name the boardroom, where all the big decisions are made, where the trustees and the session meet, to name the boardroom after her. And they decided to commission an African-American portrait artist to do a painting of her. And then people were like, well, how can we do a painting of her? We don't have a picture of her. And I said, well, we've got like a million paintings of Jesus. We don't have a picture of him. Right. And so, I said, this is part of faithful imagination. And so this past Sunday, we unveiled the painting and we commissioned the room. And it was the most joyful Sunday. Wow. Now, you would say, well, that's strange. Like, from the outside, you would say, well, why are they feeling joyful about all this? Because we had worked it through. We'd been honest, told the truth. We'd held each other graciously, let people have their opinion and this person have their opinion, and kind of work through it and let people have it. One of the things we don't do very well is give people a space to grow. It's like, oh, you think that, therefore this is who you are. You're out of here. Right? It's just like grace gives people a chance to change their minds, to augment their opinions, to embrace new perspectives. Anyway, it was a fantastic Sunday. And we all came away and said, that was good church. And so in a nutshell, that's what I think your church, our church, we have those moments to offer to the world right now, to show a kind of different way to deal with hard stuff that does not dodge the truth of it, but wraps it up in a more hopeful, gospel package.
Yes. Yeah, what a beautiful illustration of justice and love working in tandem, and something unique we have to offer the world. Thank you, Scott. That really blesses me to hear that story. And I assume if I went to your church website, I could maybe see a picture.
Yeah, there's a couple of different stories there about it, and you can see pictures. You can see what the portrait looks like, and you can see the artist, Clayton Singleton, there, and it was a good day.
Thanks be to God. That's the moments when you look around and say, wow, the spirit's at work.
That's right.
So much bigger than me, you, any of us put together. It's
I think that what you just said is actually what Christians have to offer, is this sense that the Spirit is at work still.
Yes.
And a willingness to point and say, look.
To bear witness.
Amen. Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for your time, Scott, and for the work you've put out and continue to put out in the world. Grateful to have you as a colleague, as a friend, as a mentor, and peace be with you this summer. I hope it's a good one for you.
Thank you. Peace be with you and yours there. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Jeff. All good blessings on you and yours.
Thank you. Take care, Scott.